Ray Dalio stared at the hydrological analysis report spread across his desk, his hands trembling as he processed the implications of what he was reading. It was 4:23 a.m. at Bridgewater Associates, and what he had discovered would either reshape humanity's understanding of economic value or confirm the most devastating agricultural collapse in human history. The document was a classified analysis from the United States Geological Survey, detailing how global groundwater depletion was accelerating beyond all previous projections. Ray's economic modeling showed that water scarcity was creating systemic risks that would make agriculture economically impossible by 2028, with over $250 trillion in global food production hanging in the balance. Ray had been working on this analysis for 8 months, initially as a study of agricultural commodity price volatility. What he discovered was far more terrifying than market fluctuations. Water scarcity wasn't just affecting crop yields, it was creating an economic extinction event that would destroy the foundation of human civilization within the next 3 years. The first indication of the crisis had come 6 months earlier when Bridgewater's agricultural portfolios began experiencing unprecedented losses across multiple water-dependent regions. Almond farms in California were abandoning million-dollar investments as groundwater became too expensive to pump. Wheat operations in Kansas were going bankrupt as the Ogallala aquifer dropped below economically viable levels. Cotton farms in Texas were converting to solar panels because water had become more valuable than crops. Ray's personal experience with the crisis had been devastating. His family's agricultural investment fund, which included farmland across 7 states, had lost 60% of its value in 18 months as water rights became either prohibitively expensive or legally unavailable. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who understood global resource allocation better than almost anyone had failed to anticipate the most fundamental resource scarcity of all. The morning that the Colorado River system was officially declared in dead pool status, Ray had called an emergency meeting with his entire agricultural research team. The conference room fell silent as they presented their findings. Water scarcity wasn't a gradual challenge that markets could adapt to. It was a cascade of accelerating hydrological failures that would overwhelm agriculture's ability to produce food at any economically viable price point. Ray's team had initially attributed the agricultural losses to temporary drought cycles, but the pattern was too consistent and too widespread. When they began incorporating real-time groundwater data into their economic models, the results were apocalyptic. The global food system was heading toward a collision with hydrological reality that would make previous famines look like minor supply disruptions. The data painted a terrifying picture of agricultural disintegration. Aquifers that had taken thousands of years to fill were being depleted in decades. Major river systems that supported billions of people were approaching permanent flow reduction. Glacial systems that provided seasonal water to agricultural regions were disappearing entirely. Without water, the most productive agricultural regions on Earth would become economically worthless deserts. Ray had documented specific case studies that kept him awake at night. The Central Valley of California was sinking as groundwater extraction caused land subsidence. The Punjab region of India was experiencing groundwater depletion rates that would make farming impossible within 5 years. The Murray-Darling Basin in Australia was experiencing permanent ecological collapse as water allocations exceeded renewable supply. But the most devastating finding was the feedback loop Ray had identified between water scarcity and food prices. As agricultural regions became water stressed, crop yields declined while production costs skyrocketed. Food prices were rising exponentially, but farmers were still losing money because water costs were increasing faster than food prices. The entire economic model of agriculture was breaking down. Ray's analysis showed that water had already become more valuable than oil in many agricultural regions. A gallon of water in drought-stricken areas of California cost more than a gallon of gasoline. Farmers were spending more on water than they earned from crops, making food production economically irrational. When growing food becomes unprofitable, civilization faces its most fundamental crisis. The personal impact on Ray's own investments was staggering. His Connecticut estate, which included a small organic farm that his wife had lovingly maintained for 20 years, was now struggling with irregular precipitation patterns. The farm that had once produced enough vegetables for the family and local farmers' markets was now dependent on expensive irrigation systems that made organic production economically questionable. Ray's daughter, Sarah, who managed the family's agricultural investments in the Pacific Northwest, had called him the previous week with devastating news. Their apple orchards in Washington state, which had been profitable for decades, were facing water allocation restrictions that would force them to abandon 30% of their plantings. The water rights they had purchased for $2 million were now worth more than the farmland itself. Ray walked to his office window, looking out at the Connecticut landscape that had been transformed by 3 consecutive years of irregular precipitation. Even in the relatively water-rich Northeast, farmers were struggling with unpredictable rainfall patterns that made crop planting almost impossible. The hydrological implications of what he was seeing went beyond agriculture. This was about the fundamental viability of human civilization on a planet with finite freshwater resources. Bridgewater managed agricultural investments for pension funds, university endowments, and sovereign wealth funds that represented millions of people's retirement security. Ray's fiduciary responsibility was to preserve and grow that wealth. But his analysis showed that agricultural wealth itself might be impossible to preserve in a water-scarce world. Ray returned to his desk and opened the most disturbing section of his analysis, the timeline for agricultural collapse. According to his models, the point of no return would arrive in 2028, just 3 years away. After that date, water scarcity would make large-scale agriculture economically unviable in most regions of the world, as the cost of water would exceed the value of the crops it produced. The mathematics were inexorable. Every hydrological model Ray had tested showed the same result. When the cost of water exceeded the value of food, agriculture would enter terminal decline. Food production would collapse first in the most water-stressed regions, then spread to areas that had previously seemed secure. The global food system would fragment into small localized production that could only feed a fraction of the current world population. Ray had documented specific examples of how this collapse was already beginning. Nestlé was quietly abandoning water-intensive food production facilities across the American West. Coca-Cola was relocating bottling operations away from drought-prone regions. Agricultural banks were recording massive losses as farmland became worthless when water rights were severed. Insurance companies were withdrawing from agricultural coverage in water-stressed areas. The human cost was already becoming apparent in food markets. Ray's analysis showed that food prices had increased by 200% in water-stressed regions over the past 3 years. Middle-class families in Phoenix were spending 40% of their income on groceries. Agricultural communities across the Southwest were experiencing economic depression as farms went out of business. Ray's research revealed that global grain reserves had fallen to their lowest levels in 50 years, not because of poor harvest, but because farmers couldn't afford the water needed to plant crops. Ray's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Ray, urgent. We discuss water agricultural implications for national food security. Time sensitive. Tom Vilsack. Agriculture Secretary Vilsack calling at 4:45 a.m. meant this had already escalated to the highest levels of American food policy. Ray dialed immediately. Tom, I assume this is about the hydrological agricultural modeling. Ray, we need your assessment of what happens to American food production if Western water systems continue declining at current rates. The president is being briefed tomorrow morning, and we need to understand the economic implications. Ray felt the weight of the moment. He was being asked to provide analysis that would influence American policy during the most significant food security crisis in human history. Tom, my analysis suggests we're looking at the end of industrial agriculture as we know it. When water costs exceed food values, production stops. We're not talking about higher prices. We're talking about agricultural physics. Ray, what's the timeline for this scenario? 3 years. By 2028, water scarcity will make large-scale agriculture economically impossible in most of the United States. We'll be importing food from regions that still have water, assuming such regions exist. And the scale of the impact. $250 trillion in global agricultural assets will become stranded investments. Every food system that depends on depleted groundwater or reduced river flow will face permanent shutdown. Tom, we're talking about the greatest food crisis in human history. Ray, are you suggesting that water scarcity will force us to abandon industrial farming entirely? I'm suggesting that industrial farming only worked when we could treat groundwater as a free resource. When water becomes expensive, food production becomes uneconomical. We're about to discover whether human civilization can feed 8 billion people without depleting every aquifer on the planet. Ray elaborated on his most concerning finding, Tom. The water crisis isn't just an agricultural problem. It's revealing that modern civilization's assumption that we can produce unlimited food with finite fresh water is physically impossible. When hydrological reality imposes hard limits, economic theory becomes irrelevant. Ray, what about technological solutions? Can't desalination and water recycling solve these problems? Ray, what about international coordination? Can't we develop global water sharing agreements? Tom, I've analyzed every proposed technological solution. Desalination and recycling help at the margins, but they can't overcome the fundamental physics of water scarcity. When aquifers are depleted and rivers run dry, technology becomes irrelevant. You can't engineer your way out of hydrological collapse. After ending the call, Ray sat alone in his office, grappling with the implications of what he had told the agriculture secretary. He wasn't just analyzing commodity markets anymore. He was documenting the end of the agricultural system that had sustained human civilization for thousands of years. Tom, water doesn't respect international borders, but political control of water does. We're already seeing water nationalism emerge as countries restrict exports of water-intensive agricultural products. When water becomes scarce, it becomes a weapon. Ray's computer chimed with an urgent message from his Middle East research team. Ray, new data from satellite groundwater monitoring shows accelerated aquifer depletion across major agricultural regions. FAO calling emergency meeting about global food security collapse. Need your economic impact assessment immediately. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization's quiet panic was perhaps the most telling indicator Ray had found. When the world's food security experts were preparing for systemic collapse, the crisis had moved beyond economics into survival planning. The secure phone rang again. This time it was Christine Lagarde from the European Central Bank. Ray realized his analysis wasn't academic anymore. The water agricultural crisis was accelerating faster than his models had predicted, and the world's largest food organizations were quietly preparing for agricultural collapse that most people didn't even know was coming. Ray, we need to discuss what happens to the European economy when agricultural productivity falls below food security levels. Our models show potential social collapse within this decade. Ray, I trust you've seen the latest hydrological assessments from European agricultural regions. Christine, I'm seeing systematic abandonment of water-intensive agriculture. This isn't just market adjustment, it's preparation for food system transformation. Christine, what's the European Central Bank's assessment of agricultural viability under extreme water scarcity? And what about international coordination on food security? Ray, we're quietly developing contingency plans for post-industrial agricultural economies. When markets can't price water scarcity accurately because the scarcity exceeds the food system's capacity to respond, traditional agricultural finance becomes meaningless. That's why I'm calling. Ray, we need someone with your analytical credibility to help design food systems that can function with depleted water resources. Industrial agriculture served us well, but it's not adapted for survival on a water-scarce planet. Christine, what specific alternatives are central banks considering? Christine's tone carried a gravity that Ray had never heard from a central banker when discussing agriculture. She was acknowledging that the world's economic leadership was secretly preparing for the end of industrial farming itself. Localized food production, vertical farming, water-efficient crop systems. We're studying traditional agricultural methods that sustain populations for thousands of years without depleting groundwater. Ray, when industrial agriculture becomes impossible due to water constraints, we need farming models that can maintain food security without hydrological destruction. Ray's most disturbing discovery was that the water crisis was exposing industrial agriculture's fundamental logical contradiction. The system required unlimited freshwater extraction on a planet with finite renewable water resources, but unlimited extraction was physically impossible. Water scarcity was simply the mechanism by which that contradiction was resolving itself through agricultural collapse. Ray spent the next hour reviewing his most devastating findings. The water agricultural death spiral was accelerating through multiple feedback loops. As groundwater depleted, pumping costs increased, making farming unprofitable. As farmers abandoned water-intensive crops, food production declined. As food prices rose, social instability increased, making agricultural investment impossible. Ray's personal agricultural philosophy was built on the principle that markets would always find ways to increase production and efficiency. But water scarcity was imposing hard physical limits that no amount of innovation or market mechanisms could overcome. There wasn't enough freshwater time or technology to prevent agricultural collapse. Ray opened a new document and began writing what he knew would be the most controversial agricultural analysis of his career: the hydro-agricultural death spiral, why food production cannot survive water depletion. But as he began typing, Ray realized the fundamental contradiction in his position. How could he advise clients to invest in agricultural systems that his own analysis showed were heading toward extinction? How could Bridgewater continue managing food-related assets when food production itself was becoming physically impossible? Ray stared at the message, understanding that this was the moment when his theoretical analysis became a practical existential crisis. If industrial agriculture was ending, what was the point of agricultural investment management? If food itself was becoming impossible to produce economically, how could he continue managing agricultural wealth? The secure phone buzzed with a message that crystallized his dilemma. Ray need immediate strategy for Bridgewater's water-exposed agricultural assets. Clients asking about moving to drought-proof investments, but your analysis suggests no water-safe agriculture exists. How do we preserve food-related wealth during agricultural system collapse? Agricultural Investment Director. The tragic irony was that Bridgewater's agricultural clients, pension funds, endowments, agricultural banks, represented the life savings of millions of farmers and food workers who trusted that the agricultural system would provide for their retirements. But Ray's analysis showed that system was about to collapse under the weight of hydrological reality. Ray's analysis showed that the transition period would be the most dangerous time in human history. As the old agricultural system collapsed, but before new water-efficient systems could establish themselves, billions of people would be left without reliable food security. The potential for famine, resource wars, and civilizational breakdown was enormous. Ray walked back to his window and watched the dawn break over Connecticut's increasingly unreliable agricultural landscape. Somewhere in California's Central Valley, farmers were making impossible choices between bankruptcy and agricultural abandonment. In Kansas, ranchers were selling cattle because grassland irrigation had become economically impossible. In Texas, cotton farmers were installing solar panels because energy production was more water efficient than food production. The irony wasn't lost on Ray that industrial agriculture's greatest achievement, its ability to produce massive quantities of food, had become its fatal weakness in the face of water scarcity. The system that had fed billions was now depleting the water resources that billions depended on for survival. Mr. Dalio, I understand you've reached some conclusions about water scarcity in agriculture that align with what indigenous farmers have been warning about for decades. Ray was surprised by the call, but not by the message. Dr. Shiva, my economic analysis confirms what hydrological science has been showing. Industrial agriculture cannot survive on a water-depleted planet. Ray's secure phone rang one final time. It was Vandana Shiva, the Indian environmental activist. Dr. Shiva, what kind of agricultural alternatives are you envisioning? Farming systems that prioritize water conservation over production maximization, biodiversity over monoculture, and local food security over global commodity markets. Mr. Dalio, you have the credibility to help people understand that we're not choosing between modern and traditional agriculture. We're choosing between agricultural transformation and mass starvation. Mr. Dalio, the question is what we do with that information. Do we continue pretending that technological solutions can overcome physical water limits, or do we start designing agricultural systems that work within hydrological boundaries? Help people understand that protecting water resources isn't anti-agriculture, it's pro-survival. Agriculture can't function without water, and water resources can't survive industrial agriculture that treats them as infinite commodities. Dr. Shiva. But how do we transition without causing massive hunger for the billions of people who depend on current food production? Mr. Dalio, massive hunger is guaranteed if we don't transition. Water depletion will cause far more starvation than agricultural transformation. The question is whether we choose managed transition or chaotic collapse. After ending the call, Ray sat in his office as full daylight revealed the drought-stressed landscape outside his window. The water agricultural crisis wasn't a future possibility. It was a present reality that most people were still trying to ignore. The question wasn't whether industrial agriculture would survive water scarcity, but whether human civilization would survive the transition to whatever food system replaced it. Ray made his decision. He would publish his analysis and use Bridgewater's influence to help design agricultural systems that could operate within hydrological limits. It would mean abandoning the agricultural investment philosophy that had generated massive returns for decades, but it might help humanity develop food production systems that could actually sustain human civilization. As Ray prepared to write the most important agricultural manifesto of his career, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was documenting not just the end of industrial agriculture, but the beginning of humanity's greatest challenge, learning to feed 8 billion people on a planet with finite freshwater resources. The $250 trillion question wasn't whether agriculture would collapse, but whether humanity could build sustainable food systems from the ruins before the water ran out entirely. Ray Dalio was about to find out whether the species that had mastered industrial food production was wise enough to transcend it before it depleted every drop of fresh water on Earth.